including development finance institutions in different parts of the world. So the paper that we're releasing today is about the future of Eskom. But in saying that, there's a belief among South Africans and in your own constituency as the media that fixing Eskom means just replacing a tire in a car or replacing a bolt in a boiler. What we're learning from experiences elsewhere in the world is that this is a long, protracted process which has to be undertaken with discipline. It needs to be undertaken with a clear sense of vision about where we want to go as far as the energy industry in South Africa is concerned. And it must be done in a way in which we have capable people to execute the plans that we are actually talking about. One example that we've come across from, say, Vietnam, which has kind of equivalence with South Africa in terms of the amount of energy that the economy requires, which is between 42 and 45,000 gigawatts, which is similar to ours, is that they started the process very slowly in the 1970s, gathered a lot more steam in the 1990s, but eventually it took about 20 years to get to where they wanted to get. So there are some things that will happen fairly rapidly. There are other things that need to happen in a slow, systematic, and disciplined way in order to meet the requirements of the day. So what does the paper say? So in the first instance, I want to repeat that this is the beginning of a process. This isn't the entirety of a process. This is about placing Eskom, as far as government is concerned, and this is not Gordhan's plan or anything like that, although many of you like to personalize it. It's a collaborative effort within government to take a very important entity and reposition it. There's lots of ifs and buts, there's lots of details to be worked on, but what we are clear is that Eskom can't remain as it is. But the point I want to emphasize is that these things will take time, and this process of change will require the participation of all stakeholders to actually accomplish. So in the first instance, we say that the Eskom journey into the future is dependent on the integrated resource plan that Minister Mantashe approved on the basis of an approval from Cabinet about 10 days or so. And this plan indicates the kind of energy mix that South Africa foresees for itself for the next 10 years. In other words, how much of hydro or nuclear or renewables or solar, coal, and any other form of energy that could contribute to the energy mix in South Africa, and how that mix will change over time as we go through this journey over the next decade or so. The second thing that this paper points out is how the transmission component will be separated, firstly as a functional subsidiary of Eskom Holdings. And so I want to emphasize that the next two things I'm going to talk about, transmission and generation, happens in a context where Eskom remains as a Eskom holding company, and these will be subsidiaries under Eskom Holdings. And I'll take you through some of the details just now in the PowerPoint slide, but let me go through this narrative quickly for you. So transmission will be separated, and what does transmission do? Transmission, people who work, the 5,000 or 6,000 people who work in this area, are responsible for conducting electricity from power stations to where they're required throughout South Africa. So they have, some 45,000 kilometers or something of wires, and those are wires that you see overhead. Some of those wires you'll see within a municipal boundary, others you will see in different parts of the country. And those wires are quite important. If you watch the fires that are taking place in California at the moment, it is these wires that are being managed and the electricity that passes through them by what is called the systems operator to make sure that sparks that come out of the transmission wires don't cause more fires. So those of you that are watching what's happening in California have a picture of how important this transmission component is. So firstly, it's looking after this infrastructure in transmission. Secondly, it's a systems operator. This is the team that decides how much of power is demanded at any point in time and how much of power is available from the different generation sources that energy is produced in. Thirdly, it has and will have a buying component, and this buying component will from day to day decide how much of energy does it want to, inverted commas, buy from Eskom generation, how much of energy is it taking from renewables that are currently in existence or will be in existence in the future, or from time to time, if it wants to buy power from the private sector, at what price would it actually buy it as well? So there's a buying function. And we'll show you some diagrams that will illustrate this to you as we distribute the PowerPoint to you. So there's a fair amount of detail available about how that separation process will occur. And we hope that by January or so next year, some of the physical changes that need to be made will already have been made. And our ultimate deadline for, let's call it the functional separation of transmission at the outside is the 31st of March 2020. So that's the first component. The second component is generation. Currently, Eskom generates power through 15 or 16 coal-powered stations, nuclear power through Koeberg, buys power from Kahora Bassa in the form of hydro, and it has various pump stations and peaking plants and other facilities available to it from which it actually gets power. But what it lacks as a monopoly is competition. And as a result of the lack of competition, we do not get the most effective pricing coming out of the generation side. So a proposal that government will be exploring with Eskom is the creation, for example, of 3 clusters of the coal-powered plants, and we'll come back to some of the other elements of generation. So let's say there are 5 or 4 power stations in each cluster. Each cluster will act as a business, and that business must produce power as cost-effectively as possible so that you as consumers or businesses as consumers get the lowest possible price that is available from the Eskom generation entities. But more importantly, this will set up internal competition within the Eskom-owned generating facilities that we actually have at different power stations. Experiences in Vietnam and in other parts of the world have shown that this kind of internal competition is good for business, so to speak. It's good for the consumer, and it gets greater efficiencies into the generating process as well. Eskom will also participate in developing renewable plants as well, and I'll come back to this in a moment in a different kind of context. And there'll be other generators or types of generation happening. So one example that we might or might not be aware of is so-called embedded generation that is taking place in municipalities. And here what we have is energy generated through biomass or rooftop solar, but which don't necessarily enter the transmission grid of Eskom itself, but is locally utilized in whatever way it has been designed at a local level. So what we've covered are 3 things. Firstly, the IRP as the energy basis. Secondly, the separation and creation of the transmission entity. And thirdly, the creation of competition through the creation of these clusters within the generation component, and in particular, Eskom's participation in renewables as well. The fourth area that we're looking at is the current environment. And here, again, we do require the understanding of the media as a constituency, but the public as well, that the kind of damage that state capture caused within Eskom is huge. That this is not just about somebody who stole a few billion rands and ran off to whichever island they currently are in. But the damage is systemic. And once that damage is systemic, in other words, corruption can not just happen with a few individuals. There are a string of individuals in a hierarchy that will take whatever opportunity they get in order to steal money from Eskom through procurement and other processes. But secondly, skilled people were chased out of Eskom, particularly black professionals. And thirdly, that began to harm the operations of Eskom itself. And fourthly, as a consequence, you had the impact, the negative impact on the finances of Eskom. So you have a rolling effect from the kind of state capture process into operations and into the finances of Eskom as well. We can't blame so-called state capture for everything, because there were other errors that were made as well. For example, in the design of the bigger plants at Medupi and Kusile, but we want to deal with that separately, and we'll come back to the public with a more comprehensive document on our findings in that particular regard. So, the key in the current environment is to improve the current generation of energy, make it a lot more efficient. For those of you that are familiar with the energy availability factor, that is how much of energy is each plant capable of producing. The optimum, obviously, or the maximum is 100%. Many of the power stations in Eskom and the units within those power stations are operating in the 69 to 71% zone. And what we require is for that 71% to become at least 80% sooner rather than later, in order to get the right kind of productivity from within the generation component. And it is in this regard that we often find Eskom sitting on the margin, so to speak, as far as generating energy is concerned, because it doesn't have the buffer that is required in order to create safety for itself. The second area is the financial area. And here we believe that in addition to the cost savings that Eskom talked about in the past of some 33 billion rands over a period of time, a new effort must be made to get more cost savings. So you know that Minister Mantashe, Minister Patel and myself have met the coal producers. You also know that we've identified, I don't know the names of these entities, but there are 7 companies that are making more than 100% profit on selling coal to Eskom, and the dialogue that we've started must result in a reasonable profit for the mining community and the producers of coal on the one hand, and a cost-effective supply to Eskom on the other hand. And we believe that this being one of the big cost items in Eskom, there could be substantial savings that the mining community must make a contribution to for the survival of this entity. Similarly, in diesel, in terms of the cost of the first 3 rounds of renewables, all of those areas are open to discussion and negotiation, including the procurement of parts from original equipment manufacturers. And there's been malfeasance in this area as well. In other words, there's been overpricing of some of these services and parts, as a result of which it has a negative impact on the cost structure of Eskom. The next area is the financial area. And here it's very clear, and you'll see from the paper, the kind of support that government through the Treasury has offered to Eskom, including the announcement by Minister Mboweni earlier in the year of 23 billion rands per year over a 10-year period, and the current special appropriation bill that is before Parliament. I'm not going to indicate to you what he's going to say because I don't know tomorrow, but he might make further pronouncements in this regard tomorrow. But the big issue that many of us would be concerned with is what's happening to this 450 to 500 billion rands worth of debt. And here it's fairly clear that debt cannot be dealt with in its own right. What the marketplace wants to see, and investors that have lent money to Eskom want to see, and to government as a whole, is that we have a plan for the future of Eskom in terms of a new business model. Secondly, that we have a plan to get more efficient and cost-effective operations going. Thirdly, that we are undertaking cost savings of the type that I've actually spelled out. And in that context, we'll have to look at a process by which engagement with lenders take place, and we'll keep you informed as and when that actually happens into the future. The next area is the just transition area that I indicated earlier on, and here we talk about the minimum emission standards that have to be complied with. At the moment, if there's retrofitting of clean coal technology, it's going to cost somewhere between 170 and 200 billion rands, which we don't have. But Eskom has started the process of incrementally beginning to install some of this technology, and other measures need to be taken in order to meet these minimum emission standards. Secondly, I've indicated to you the kind of energy transition that is happening globally, but also as reflected in the Integrated Resource Plan. And South Africa over the next 10 or 20 years will be a witness to and experience the change in energy supplies and the mix of energy supplies as we actually go forward. Thirdly, as I pointed out earlier as well, as we talk about decommissioning power stations, the older ones that are 50 and 55 years old, there's some research being done elsewhere in the world that we've come across about alternate uses of the infrastructure in many of those areas, including usage for battery storage, usage for installing renewable plants in close proximity and utilizing the transmission parks and so on, even if coal-generated power is not available. So there's some area of innovation that our own research institutes are doing, but people are doing elsewhere in the world. But the key point is that together with labor and the mining community, we want to start a pilot project in one of these areas so that we understand what a just transition for workers and communities actually mean in practice. And once we get that going, we'll learn a lot of lessons about how to ensure that workers are reskilled, are redeployed, new kinds of opportunities for jobs are created within the renewables and other areas, including in the battery storage area, and how communities can also, in terms of the enterprises that they have within those communities, survive any changes that take place in this context as well. Finally, the paper looks at the implementation question. All these ideas are fine. What are you going to do with them? So we've got a plan for the next 2 months and then for the next year, and a broad idea of what follows in the years ahead after that. So there's a clear implementation plan. An implementation machinery would be created and a leader for that machinery within Eskom itself. A monitoring entity will be created within the Department of Public Enterprises that will monitor the implementation and progress that we actually make, so that these are not just promises and ideas that we are putting forward. Real change must actually happen on the ground and must happen in the way in which the planning actually takes place. Now, there are some questions that you're going to ask that I'm going to anticipate. The first is the question of when are you appointing the new CEO? The board has completed its work. It has made its recommendations. We're now going through a government process, and hopefully next week government will be able to announce the new CEO of Eskom Holdings. Secondly, there will be some changes to the board, both in terms of filling vacancies, but also bringing in a set of skills that are appropriate to the next 3-year cycle that Eskom has to go through. A cycle in which there will be structural changes and challenges, and where change management becomes a crucial element, together with the kind of commercial skills that are going to be required in this environment as well. Thirdly, the transmission entity itself will have an interim board of 3 or 5 people whose task it will be to drive the process of change and the establishment of the transmission entity, and that hopefully we will announce in the next week or so as well. As far as the debt issue is concerned, Minister Mboweni will give further pronouncements on that tomorrow. And what you might find interesting, which we found interesting, is there's a interesting corollary with Pemex. Pemex is the energy or oil SOE, so to speak, in Mexico. And Pemex found itself in a very similar situation to Eskom. So there's some interesting lessons from Pemex for South Africa as we deal with this particular issue as well. On the question of municipal debt, the President has made it clear, as has government and the governing party, that non-payment and non-compliance with one's obligations is not acceptable, and that all of us as South Africans need to participate in a campaign to ensure that those who can afford to pay must pay. And we are quite categorical on that. So further work will be happening in due course in the various structures of government to get some kind of campaign going which will start encouraging people to pay or face the consequences of not paying, particularly where they can afford to pay as well. Finally, before I take you quickly through the presentation, a message to the board and the staff of Eskom. This has been a very difficult period for them. And I believe that the vast majority of the 40-odd thousand people that work in Eskom are honest people. They are dedicated to making that entity work, and they are dedicated to ensuring that the country succeeds. I had a brief interaction with the board just before I got here and gave a similar message to them as well. So we are grateful for the work that they do, but all of us need to cooperate, including the staff, to make sure that we can make this new journey that Eskom has to undertake a successful one and give it the full commitment that we actually require. Now let me just take you through a few slides. I won't take you through all of them. You'll have access to all of them, and then explain some of those things to you. Let me just, oops, this technology. So
It's on the screen.
all right, this slide really gives you the rationale for why we need to begin to have a new roadmap for Eskom and a new business model, which I've spelled out to you to some extent. The next slide is some of the reasons that are motivating us, as I pointed out earlier on, to take Eskom in a new direction, including the risk that we carry as a country, where 95% of our energy comes from one source. And that means that we have all our eggs, so to speak, in one basket, and that creates its own risk for the economy and for the people of South Africa as well. And clearly, Eskom is a large entity to manage, but more importantly, there's no cost transparency. So ideally, we want to move to a position where every power station manager not only understands how much of coal is required and which repairs are required to be undertaken, but understands the profit and loss statement for that power station and whether they are operating that power station in a cost-effective way. We'll get there sooner rather than later, but also we want to remove the moral hazard. And by moral hazard, we mean that once you know that government will back anything you do, and whenever you get into financial difficulties, it means you can spend money as you like. This happened in the 2008, 2009 financial crisis in the US, where the banks knew they could get into derivatives and all sorts of fancy footwork, which cost billions of rands, but also impacted on the global economy. And the American government had to step in, the British government had to step in, and the Europeans also had to step in to save their banks and their banking system. So we don't want to be in a similar situation. We need to remove Eskom from that kind of dynamic as we go into the future. The Eskom of the future, as we said, this page is all mixed, is the one that I've spelled out to you, the three subsidiaries in generation, transmission, and distribution. Let me point out that we're not giving too much of focus on distribution at this point in time because of the complexities of municipalities earning a fair amount of their revenue from electricity sales and the premium that they make on the sales. So there's a bit more study that we need to do and interact with the various stakeholders on the municipal front and determine a way forward as far as municipal distribution is concerned. And we'll come back to how we then manage Eskom distribution in this kind of context. So that's the Eskom of the future. Resolving the operational problems, I indicated to you the urgency of getting generation onto the right kind of footing. We need to keep the breakdowns in Eskom below 9,500 megawatts, and even that is too high. So we are basically saying we have the potential to generate 45,000 megawatts, but at any point in time, we have anything between 10,000 and 13,000 megawatts out of action. And that's not an efficient way to run a big operation like Eskom. And we might be looking for, with our partners in mineral resource and in energy, for 2,000 megawatts of additional power to give us the buffer whilst the long-term maintenance of some of these plants can actually take place. This is a simple diagram which would help you to understand, particularly for members of the public, what we are talking about when we talk about the different components of Eskom. So on your left is electricity generation. Those are the power stations. And those power stations produce and sell energy in the future to electricity transmission. That's the transmission component that I spoke about. And when we have all of this in place, transmission must be able to pay generation. That's the bottom curve arrow that you actually see. Transmission will then sell electricity to distribution, which will then sell electricity to the final consumer. But the distributor at the moment in South Africa is both municipalities and Eskom itself. So this is a simple way of how the buying and the selling process will work. And if you look at the top arrow, that's how the flow of electricity takes place. But equally important is the bottom arrow. Whilst electricity is supplied and sold at the top, money must actually come back into the system to transmission and generation as well. We're familiar with the challenges that Eskom faces, so we don't have to get into that. The next is the integrated resource plan that I referred to. and the various mixes that we have as far as energy is concerned. This is what the transmission component will actually look like. So on your left are the different sources of generation. Eskom generation, the independent power producers, both renewables and independent coal producers. SAPP refers to not the software system, it refers to the South African power pool of which South Africa is a part. We both supply energy into this pool but also get energy from it. We have peaking plants as well that I referred to earlier on. And on the right-hand side are the distributors or the consumers of energy. In the middle is the systems operator, the person or persons who decide what is the demand for energy at any particular point in time. On the left will be the buyers from the generation side. At the bottom on the middle is the management of the grid, so that the grid wires are in good shape throughout their existence. And then you need a supply agreement on the right-hand side of the box to the consumers of energy. If you're looking at the key functions within the transmission entity, here's some details, and we're not going to go through that. The next slide indicates to you the kind of detailed work that is being done at the 3 different levels in order to get the restructuring process off the ground, and there's a lot of detail that sits behind it if you want proof that we are working on it. Then we tell you in this slide what are the different components that I spoke to earlier on as well. Then we get to the generation side. Carry on. This one. So those are on the left-hand side, the 3 clusters that I spoke about of power stations that will compete with one another and create this greater efficiency that we are actually talking about. And on the right-hand side are the various, if you like, support functions, including the supply of primary energy to generation as well. I'm trying to synchronize this with my colleague here. The restructuring of Eskom has those benefits of increasing transparency, particularly in respect of costs, driving and making sure our aim must be that the supply of energy must be ahead of economic growth, just about, so that we're not acting as a constraint on economic growth in any kind of way. And it'll take some effort to actually get there. To get competition in generation, like I pointed out earlier on, and have a stable system, both in generation and transmission. And a lot more investment needs to take place by municipalities in the reticulation of electricity at a local level as well. Then we're looking at the financial components. There are various, that's okay, let's move. So I spoke about the reviewing of the coal contracts, the new procurement approach that we will engage in, reviewing of the IPP contracts so that we have a mutually beneficial outcome both for those that have installed renewables and ourselves and Eskom. Disposal of non-core assets. So for example, we have Eskom finance company that's worth something like 6 or 7 billion rands. We will start the process of disposing of that so that that cash can be utilized within Eskom itself. And we then look at employees and what kind of savings we can get there. But the key here is that labor will become a partner in this process and look at various options outside of retrenchments as we get into this process. Collection of the municipal debt is the next item, and the implications for tariffs. I mean, ideally, you cannot talk about cost-reflective tariffs for Eskom if the cost structure remains intact and is an extravagant one. What you need is to narrow down the extravagance in the cost structure, if you like, and the excesses in the cost structure. So when we talk about cost-reflective tariffs, if you have a good dream, you might want to dream about tariffs coming down instead of remaining exactly where they are. The just transition is then explained in the slides that actually follow. And then we look at the implementation plan. So there's a broad idea in the slide of what some of the objectives for different phases are. The next slide gives you the kind of implementation structures and monitoring structures that we will actually set up. And tomorrow morning, we then start with the process of implementing some of the things that we are actually talking about. So let me stop here, ladies and gentlemen, and summarize as follows. Eskom cannot remain as it is. Energy is absolutely crucial to this economy and to the households in South Africa. And we have to have a reliable source of energy for South Africans, whether they are in business or in households or students who are studying for their exams, for example. Thirdly, we have to resolve the operational issues. At the same time, we need to shift towards the new business model and create the transmission entity and the generation clusters as we are talking about them, and resolve some of the cost issues within Eskom itself, whilst looking at the question of a new leadership within Eskom and a resolution to the debt issues, which my colleague, the Minister of Finance, will address as we go forward. I'm optimistic that this is all possible, and what it requires is for all the different stakeholders that are connected to Eskom in one way or another, whether you are a coal supplier or a technology supplier, or working within Eskom or other interested parties, all of us will have to make a contribution for this project to succeed. And I'm sure that if we get that kind of goodwill, we will succeed. Thank you very much.